Thank you for being here with us. Before I officially turn the mic over to our presenters, I want to take a moment to share the legalese, remind everyone that this program is offered for informational purposes only, and that our remarks today do not create an attorney-client relationship. So a reminder that this is being recorded and that nothing about today's forum is private. You are certainly welcome to speak with any of us after the panel if you have questions, and we'll provide you with our contact information. With that, thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. So as you heard, we're gonna try and go through grants, but it's a giant world and there's a lot more to it than what we're gonna get to. So we'll start off with what is a grant. Fran's gonna talk in a minute about the different kinds of funding vehicles that exist, but what I want to start with is a very sort of simple definition, right? Grant is a financial award. And we put not a contract because it's not, although it acts a lot like a contract. So you'll get into lots of specific things you have to do when you get this award. And the whole point of what is a grant is that it has a specific purpose, and the purpose has money that you've associated with it by asking for that grant. And so usually the way that I talk about grants with clients when I work with them or with in general, what I always say is that you end up writing at least 3 grants if you're going for grant funding. The first is the grant that you're going to write to try to win. The second is the negotiation piece, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then the third is the modification that you're going to do halfway through your period of performance when you realize you have some things you want to adjust. And so when you're thinking about that, I always start from the place, what's going to get you to win? And what are the funds set aside to do? And that's the restricted purpose, right? There's going to be a grant that has a reason it exists. You're going to ask for it for a very specific purpose, and you're going to allocate funding for it. Grants also, as you can see, they have a set period of performance. In some cases, that set period of performance has some flexibility, but that will depend on the terms and conditions and where you're actually getting your money from. And the last is the obligations, right? When you apply for grant funding, you get a grant. You have said that you will do certain things. And if you meet those obligations, then you've done the minimum to receive that grant and to be in good standing afterward. If you don't, then there are consequences. And so you have to deal with sort of the obligations for what it creates. So, great. Back to you.
Great. So for the folks here in the audience, how many of you are with nonprofits? Okay, how about government? Yeah, maybe just attorneys. Okay, excellent. So law student. We're going to talk a little bit about the different types of grants, but also depending on the type of entity that you are is also going to be different. So if you are a government getting grant funding, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to do because you're going to have different policies in place. If you're a nonprofit, it's a lot easier to shift those policies quickly. If you are a government, it takes you might have to get different approvals, whether that's from council or from different departments to actually change things. So a lot of people think of grants, as federal grants, and that's something that Pat and I have extensive experience with. But you also can get grants from the state. You can get grants from philanthropy, and each one's going to have different rules and different things. A lot of the state funding, sometimes it's passed through from the federal government. Sometimes you might get a grant from the city of Cleveland if you're in Cleveland, or your locality. They might have that might be passed through funding from a state, and that might be passed through funding from the federal government. So depending on the source of the funds is where you're going to look at how you have to manage those funds. So if they are federal dollars, even if they're passed through the state level to the city level or county level, you're going to have to use whatever the federal government says and whatever the rules are around those grants. If you get a grant from a foundation lot less restrictive. But the thing is that depending on how you get your funding for your organization or for, whether you're a government or a nonprofit, if you get multiple sources, you're going to really want to think about how do you put policies in place that you're not going to have a specific policy for each type of funding, right? So where is the policy that is going to, you don't want it to be so restrictive. The federal policies can sometimes be very restrictive. So if you're a nonprofit, you might not want all of your funding to have to be spent the way that the federal government says. If you are a government entity, you actually might want to do that, or you might even have more restrictive regulations from your own government. So there's a lot of things when you're thinking about funding and your sources of funding, whether that's going to be from philanthropy all the way through, federal funding. What is your mix, and then how do you want to put things in place so that you can comply? Because if you're a small organization, that's a lot of work, and that's a lot for one person. You might just have one person who's doing your finance. That's a lot to put on one person. And so there's a lot of things that you need to think about as you're doing these things and be cognizant. A lot of people who get federal funding as a small nonprofit don't even know that they have to follow the federal guidelines for procurement and things like that. So it's just something to be aware of when you're going for funding. What is the source? And what are the rules? We'll get into the compliance part of it and when we think you need to actually pay attention. But at the outset, when you're thinking about funding and what you want to go for, you kind of need to think in these buckets.
So what I mentioned this a minute ago a little bit. This is not really a lot of the things that we're going to cover today. I just very briefly want to talk for a second about the grant life cycle. The thing that we start with is this pre-award phase, right? And all of you are always in this phase anyway. And this is you thinking about what programs you might have, what projects you think might be worth getting a grant, how you're going to use grant funding to support your operation. And so in this pre-award phase, the thing that a lot of what Fran just mentioned and what we will talk about kind of starts then. And it really starts, in my mind, with the notice of funding, the NOFO or the NOAA or the POA, or depending on where it comes out from, has different names. But that's the thing that says, here is a funding opportunity. Here's the stuff that's in the funding opportunity that you'll need to respond to. When I started working in grants, what I thought was, once you've got that done, once you've applied for the grant, you can set that aside and go about the rest of your business. And yet everything that's going to happen after you receive funding is it's going to say reference the NOAA, reference the NOFO, reference the documentation that started, and a lot of stuff related to, for example, allowability of costs, or if you're allowed to do a specific type of programming, is going to relate to whether or not it was in that starting document. So that's a super, super important piece, and it will have later impacts, but that's where you're starting this compliance journey, is in really reading and understanding the funding announcement. When you're in this pre-award phase, when you're trying to get the grant, we at New Growth, we have a group that does lots of, a grant writing team that does a lot to help organizations apply for funding. We always talk a lot about telling your story, right? Like, what is separate from the technical aspects of what it is that you're trying to do? Like, what's the story you're trying to tell? If you're choosing to seek federal funding, each of the different agencies has a different thing they want to hear. And each administration has different things that they want each of those agencies to prioritize. So, for example, the Department of Labor. Under the Biden administration, the Department of Labor is really focused on worker rights, right? And so all of their grant opportunities have language in them about really good jobs and proving that you can meet the standards for good jobs. Under the Trump administration, the Department of Labor has shifted its focus a lot more to be employer friendly. They want everything that you're going to write, when you're telling that story, they want to hear, how is this going to benefit employers and workers, but employers as the primary vector for their priorities. So those are the things that relate to when you're trying to tell that story. And then the last part on this one is really about submission. If you don't, as an organization, have access to what's called sam.gov, it's how you create a profile to apply for federal funding. you should start that process pretty much right away. We always want to have that. It's a requirement for almost every federal grant and then any of those pass-throughs that Fran mentioned. So even if in Cleveland you're trying to get funding from the community development corporations, sometimes they're going to require you to have a SAM registration because that money comes through housing and urban development to the city of Cleveland, to the CDC, to you as a maybe implementer of process policy. So submission is really complicated sometimes. It's almost never simple, but it can sometimes be easier and sometimes harder. So it just depends on this as you do different pieces. So then after the pre-award phase, right, congratulations, you've gotten the award. So that's great. We'll talk mostly about that, mostly about implementation. And then there's that phase of closeout after the grant has ended when you have sort of the reconciliation at the very end. All the things that we talk about are fairly straightforward, but very in-depth. And so if you get a federal grant, it will tell you how to do the closing. It will tell you how to do all the things we talk about. But there's 8,000 pages of documentation that you need to read to do that. And so if you need help with that, like ask for help. That's the other thing that I'll pass over to Fran in a second here. But like if you're struggling with trying to understand something, just ask for help, right? There's someone who can help you. Especially in this town, we have a lot of great resources for grants. So ask for help. Get some help from people who can. Yeah. So go ahead.
And before I move on to once you get the award, the one thing I would add to what Pat said is, you know, we did a presentation actually with the Bar Association a year ago, January, because a lot of nonprofits were very concerned with the change in administration, what that would mean for them and their funding. And as we saw, it's a totally different landscape. Many people had grants that were already in progress that got canceled. And then, you know, you heard in the news, and maybe you even suffered from it. You know, if your grant had certain words in it, you got canceled, right? And so it's a different landscape. What I would say, and in anticipation, you know, what Pat was saying is, in telling your story, you can still do the work, right? So the advice that we gave to nonprofits last year, and what I would still say is the same, is your work is your work, and how you tell that story can be different. You can use different words. I do a lot of clean energy work. And you know, under the Biden administration, it was about you know, carbon reduction and climate change. We do not use those words anymore. But it is about energy security, and it is about energy dominance. And did you know that 93% of the energy that came on the grid just last year alone was from solar power? We are in an energy emergency, that is correct, and it takes a long time to get new power on the grid. So if we are going to be dominant, if we are going to be secure, we need all sources of energy. And so you can still use renewables and you can still use clean energy in the terms of the new administration. So I would just caveat, you know, like a lot of people are concerned about the change of, you know, it's literally been a 180 in terms of where we were going to where we're going now. But I think that the work still stays true. And so it's really about how do you tell your narrative and how do you use the words that they are using to put your work into place, right? The work doesn't change. And frankly, a lot of people are talking, you know, with DEI, and now it's not in favor. Well, the fact is that, again, workers' rights, or, you know, marginalized communities and getting people access to jobs, that is, you can shift and change the way that you use that language to fulfill whatever the grant is looking to do. So I would just encourage that and try and figure out how do you change your narrative to still accomplish your mission that you're looking to accomplish. So on that note, you won. How to spend the money. So there's a lot of things. You know, then that's really where we want to focus a lot of our attention today, is like, once you get the money, what do you do with it? And a lot of people, I'm actually surprised, but then a lot of people are surprised that, oh, well, I'm just going to get grants and I can spend it the way that I want. And that is not correct. You have to spend it the way that you said you were going to spend it in your budget. And then the dollars that you get are allocated to those resources. So if you are saying that it's 50% of this one full-time employee's salary, then you have to find the other 50% somewhere else. And you're gonna have to demonstrate that. So I think a lot of people are surprised by that. So then, you need to start thinking about, okay, how do we spend it? Pat and I were just chatting before we started here, and when you look at, you get from the federal government, you will get an actual letter that says notice of award, and it will tell you who your person is that you need to talk to and what rules you need to follow. And it literally does describe everything. But I think because so many things are legal, there's a lot of details in it. People get scared, or they're just like, well, I can't read this. It's over my head. I would say, I'm not advocating for, replacing legal work with AI, but you can, run it through an AI simulator and then try and figure out what it says. But because it is very specific and it is very detailed, but it is very prescribed, right? So there is some ways to learn how to finesse that, I guess would be said. So don't depend 100% on AI. But I do think if you need help to just get a sense, if you are a smaller entity and need some help, that would be a good. I would recommend that. And then everything's going to be prescribed. How do you draw down the funds? What do you need to do? Different funding is going to have different ways to do it. They might give you one big check at the outset, but that's, fewer and fewer sources are doing that. So, they have portals, you can draw it down. You're going to have to spend your funding, and then you're going to have to prove what you spend. And I'm sure if any of you had federal grants in the last year with the portals being frozen, it was a nightmare, right? I mean, this is not anything that you would have dreamt of, because when you get the award, you're excited and you're expecting that you get to spend it. And you don't expect that the funds get frozen, but I think we're all too familiar with all of the procedures and how things work. And then we're going to talk a little bit more, but you need to have internal controls. And you need to be thinking about, how do I make sure that I'm following the policies and procedures, and how am I doing these? And then also, like I said, you should be tracking your budget as you go along, and making sure that you are spending the funds the way that you said you were, and knowing where the alternate funds are coming from. If you need, again, I'll use that full-time employee example, where you have that other 50%, and maybe you won't get it till later on in the year, right? You can pay that person at the outset, right? But you just can't pay them for the whole year. And we'll talk a little bit about, grant modification, because that could be an area where you could look to change it if you don't get that other source of funding. But you're going to really want to stick to whatever you wrote and try and stick to it as close as possible. Cute.
Great. So now we're going to talk about the fun one, which is costs, allowable costs, unallowable costs, and that kind of stuff. I'm mostly going to speak from a federal perspective. Most of the work that I do is in a federal grant space, and most of that is on the spectrum of how restrictive or not grant rules and regulations and terms and conditions are. The feds usually have the most restrictive, and so that's where I'm trying to lean in. But sometimes these will be slightly different, especially for state philanthropy, especially is very different. The way that the federal government figures out if you're allowed to spend money on a specific thing, you're going to start by looking at the grants, the notice of award, right? So you have applied to, let's just make up the Department of Labor, and they give you a notice of award, and it says, you've received this many dollars across these specific cost categories that you told them you were going to spend the money in, so personnel or contractual things, etc. And then they'll have at the bottom of that there'll be 20 pages of program-specific requirements. And it's really important to look at those and have a sense of those and to keep that handy, because you're going to come back to that a million times. And every time you think to yourself, is this a cost that I can spend money on? Am I allowed to do this? That's the first place you're going to look. Because in some cases, there's some Department of Labor grants where they'll say, you are allowed to do advertising and marketing and conferences and spend money on lunches, because it's let's call it a demonstration grant, or like an experience where you're trying to do something to pilot a new program. And some Department of Labor grants, you're not allowed to spend money on any of those things. And usually it's outlined in there, and usually the way that it'll go, this is where people fall asleep. Usually the way that this will go is it'll say, reference the funding opportunity announcement if this is allowable. So you'll be like, okay, I have that document. I downloaded it. I went to that presentation. He said to save it. I saved it. So you go back to it. And in that, it'll say reference federal regulation 235. It'll point you to a new place. And then you go to that. And then it's a constant cycle of trying to get to a new place. When we try to think about how you're allowed to use federal funding, the overall guiding light is called uniform grant guidance. Believe it or not, that's the colloquial term for it. It's 2 CFR 200, and it's got a million different things, and that's all I'll say about that. So the way that the Fed's trying to decide if the cost is allowable, you're going to start with those terms and conditions. You're going to look at the funding opportunity announcement, and then there's a general offhanded thing that they say: is it necessary? Is it allocable? And is it reasonable? Those are the cost questions that your program officer is going to ask. Those are the questions you'll need to ask yourself. So is it necessary means, is it necessary to this grant? Right? So maybe the grant says we're going to host 5 grant sessions just like this. And is it necessary to pay the presenter? No. So they'd say you might need special permission if you want to pay a presenter. And you could ask, right? You could ask that question, and they can tell you if they think it's allowable or not. And you would make the case to say, well, Fran's a real expert. We should pay her. Patrick's just like a guy we found on the street. We're not paying him. And they might be like, great, you should pay Fran. I mean, I don't think you're going to pay him. But as an example. So is it necessary to the grant, right? The second one, is it reasonable, is basically, would a normal person think this costs too much money? So if, again, using this made up example, if someone on the street found out that Fran was paid $25,000 to be here, and I was paid $0, and the next few people were all paid $0, they probably would think, I don't necessarily know what Fran brings to the table, but that seems not necessarily reasonable, right? So that's kind of a general, and these things are like extremely squishy, right? On purpose, right? And these are guiding points, not these are not code of regulations. So they say these words, but what they mean can be flexible. And then allocable, is this something that has effectively a line item in the budget that you submitted, right? So I was working on a grant and we were closing it out, and they wanted to do a thing that was a contractual thing. They wanted to pay someone for putting together a thing that they needed. And there was not a line item for it. They had plenty of money left in the grant. And the program officer was super supportive of them doing it. And it was related to the grant. They just didn't have a place to park that expense on the budget. And so we had to create a place, right? So you go through a process to do that. Fran mentioned modification, and that's like where that lives. You create a place for that to live, and now you can just chunk the money in it or find some new way to do it. So that's how you think about costs, right? Secondarily here is procurement. The way that procurement, what I have found working in the grants world is that the words that are extremely off-putting when you start end up being the perfect word to describe this thing. And it's really annoying and frustrating because I'll be trying to talk to someone and like you can see the light leave their eyes when you say procurement. And it happens every time. So, but procurement, the way that the procurement is set up is guided by 2 things. The first is that uniform grant guidance. It has bare minimums, right? So if you, as an organization, let's say you started a brand new community college, the Metropolitan Bar Association Community College, and you were building this into your documentation. You're saying, what's our procurement policy? So you would, at minimum, need to set up 3 thresholds. They're listed on the screen, right? So the first is what's called a micro purchase, and that's any amount up to $15,000. And that's like the ability to purchase stuff without getting multiple bids, multiple quotes, multiple RFPs, going outside. That's like, I just need a laptop and I can go online to Best Buy and find 3 good laptops. That's enough, right? That's effectively what a micro purchase is. A small purchase is up to $350,000. These limits have changed recently also. And so like kind of like that uniform grant guidance does change from time to time. So you can't just download it today and be good forever. You'd have to check it when you get a grant award. But when you're talking about small purchases, these are things that you're going to want to get multiple costs from external sources. So it may be okay to say, I can find, like, I want to hire someone to do technical assistance in grants compliance because I don't want to have to do this once I've finished reading this document. So I want to hire New Growth to do it. New Growth, can you come and do this? I'll say, sure. But you also then need to find other prices from others, right? So like, I'll give you a quote and I'll say this scope of work costs $20,000, $50,000, whatever it is. And you're going to say, okay, great. But you got to find another option somewhere else. You have to have like, effectively, you have to have 3 quotes. They don't have to be bids. They don't have to be signed and sealed. They don't need to be things like that. They just need to be real quotes. And you can even just find them online and print off the PDF, print to PDF, save it, and you're good to go. And then the large purchases are above 350, and those are ones where you do have to do like competitive bidding, right? And the idea here is you're not shunting money to your brother-in-law's construction company. Turns out they don't do the thing you need, but like whatever. So I said there are 2 things that guided procurement, and that was one. The second one is your other governing bodies. So if you did have a community college, you would also need to adhere to the Ohio revised code and the Attorney General's office, and they have rules for procurement as well. Their rules are different rules, right? But they'll make you, so then you end up in this place where you're like, okay, well, we've created a policy that adheres to the federal guidelines. Like Patrick said, they're usually more restrictive. So like, we should be good, right? And the Attorney General is going to say, no, we have rules that everyone has to do. And they're more restrictive because they're more specific, right? They're a lot more specific. So then it's going to be like, okay, purchases up to 25,000, we're fine. Over 25,000, we need 3 sealed bids or whatever. I mean, whatever it is, I don't remember off the top of my head. But procurement, so once you get a grant, you want to think about how you're going to purchase the things that you were awarded the grant to purchase. And by that, I also mean contracts, supplies, equipment, that sort of stuff. And if you look at it and you think, I have to buy something with this grant funding, you need to then look and say, do I have my own procurement policy, which is almost never true for most organizations unless they're sizable enough. Then you're going to say, how am I going to do that? You're going to just quickly draft one. Fran mentioned AI. It's extremely useful in cases like these. So you're going to go in there saying, I just got a grant. I need to buy something. What do I need to know? Then procurement's going to pop up and you're going to say, can you create a procurement policy that looks right? And it's going to put together something that at least gives you the basics. So you have something to compare against, right? Now, AI hallucinates. And so you'll need to like read it and verify it for yourself and like compare it to some of these things. But I use it a lot to get people started on this kind of stuff when they don't want to pay like $20,000 a year for someone to come and help them walk through these whole steps. And it's an okay first step. The final 2 that are on here, time and effort reporting. So Fran mentioned if you have a grant and you have a person that you've got paid half time with grant funding, it's always true. It's especially true in cases where you split person's time, but you need to keep track of how much time they're spending allocated to the grant. And so the way that you do that at bare minimum is an Excel spreadsheet, a PDF, a timesheet, something like that. When you do a time and effort report, you fill out, okay, so Patrick spent 5 hours this week on this grant, and then your supervisor signs it, and you hold on to it, and usually no one's ever going to ask. There's almost no cases where they're going to care too deeply. They sometimes do, so that's why we say, like, right, this isn't legal advice, I'm going to tell you not to keep track of all your records, because you should do that. But when you're doing time and effort reporting, if someone's 100%, it's super easy. So then it's just 100, like they're only on this grant, they're only paid on this grant, that's all they're doing, so it's just much easier. If your organization has a timesheet or like uses ADP or Payday or Work Now or whatever different system, like then they're super easy because then you just have a record as long as you have that system, make copies, PDFs, whatever, save it in files. And then the last one is subawards and subrecipients. If you're the main receiver of a grant, and as the main receiver of the grant, let's say that you're, let's say you're the Ohio Association of Community Colleges, and you got $1 million to do grant funding opportunity things like this panel that we're doing today. And you say, well, the Ohio Association of Community Colleges is located closer to Columbus than it is to here. We're going to subaward some of this money to all these community colleges across the state. And so our association has a new community college, so they're receiving some of these supplements. So you can do this two ways, right? Usually, best practice, you do it when you're writing the grant application. You're going to name someone, literally name them as a subawardee or subrecipient. You can also do it later with a modification. But if you're doing a subawardee, you're going to say they are going to take on some of the work of this grant. As opposed to like a contractor, like we're going to hire New Growth to help us with technical assistance. Like that's a contract related to things supporting it. It's not doing some of that work. So then a subawardee, as the main grantor, then the Ohio Association of Community Colleges in this case, would have to effectively serve as the federal agency monitoring and keeping track of what the Bar Association Community College is doing. So they're going to be the ones who say, you need to follow all of these policies. You're going to need to follow the rules. You're going to report back to us, and then we're going to report up to where we got the funding from in the first place. Right? So effectively, a subawardee treats the person who gives them the money as the main grantor. That person then treats the other one as their grantor, right? So it's like steps in the chain. And the middle person, right? Like the Ohio Association of Community Colleges here, it's a super big responsibility to make sure that their subawardees are doing what they said they do and behaving appropriately. So like they're stuck, like right, they're a middle person and they're stuck in the middle, right? So like they've got to make sure that they're satisfying whoever gave them the money and making sure that whoever they give money to does all the right stuff. That's a lot. It's all easier than this. So
Well, and that, yeah, like if you are a grantee with sub grantees, like you are not, it's not fun because you have to spend your money the right way and then you got to manage all the people who are spending your sub awards the right way. And so you're doing it both ways. The one thing I would just add that is not in terms of like these grants. I have extensive experience working for the city of Cleveland and in the Office of Sustainability where we worked, we actually got legislation back in 2007 to allow us to apply for grants. And you have to have permission to just even apply as a governmental entity, which a lot of people don't even realize. That's very restrictive. Then you have to have permission to accept and then permission to spend. We got this legislation that gave us blanket authority to apply for and spend grants. It was in the last 4 years, council got rid of that authority. But what's really difficult if you're a governmental entity is grants, because you have to have authority, like I said, to apply, accept, and spend. But a lot of these deadlines are very quick. And so to get legislation to just apply is very cumbersome. And so if there are other like governmental people out there, what I would recommend is, I mean, there's things that you can put in place for transparency's sake and all these other things. Like there's a lot of things that you can do to allow for the ball to get rolling. And you can still have transparency and accountability at the back end. One thing that we did with the city of Cleveland with the Office of Sustainability was work with nonprofit partners to get funding to then spend a lot of the grant funds. Again, in accordance with however the grants were supposed to be spent, but to take them out of that procurement difficulty, right? I mean, just takes so much time. And so what I would say is, depending on your organization and what you're doing, there's a lot of creative ways to work with partners to facilitate some of this stuff. Now, you're still going to have to, wherever the grants are coming from, you still have to follow those rules, right? So I'm not advocating for any type of thing that's outside of having to follow the prescription that the grant gives you. But we all have lived in different environments where it's very, very restricted to just even get the dollars, let alone spend them. And so I would just encourage you to think of different ways outside of this dynamic to how can you do that and have a little more flexibility to get those funds.
And while friends, I would also add to that, you said that the timelines are short. They are way shorter now than they were a year and a half. They are getting shorter and shorter. And I'll give you 3 examples of that, right? So TRIO is a federal Department of Education funding opportunity that comes out every couple of years. It has multiple different programs. there's one that just came out yesterday. So like, huzzah, the money from the Department of Education, though now it's coming through the Department of Labor, something like that. So, but this is coming out, which is great. The last time it came out, they gave out 453 awards. This time we're expecting 175 awards. So like, not great to start. Secondly, is it used to be something like 200 days from announcement to application deadline, and this year it's 45 days. Doesn't mean people can't or won't apply, but it is intentionally designed, feels intentionally designed to like get the money out as quick as possible. And if you're not ready, get ready next time. That's one example. The second would be, well, I'll just give you two examples for issue time. The second one is there's a thing, also Department of Education. It came out last year. It's called FIPSI. It's for post-secondary education grades, right? So colleges are effectively the only eligible applicants. It came out on November 1st and was due November 25th. In the middle, or it was due December 1st, but like in the middle there was Thanksgiving, right? So like, I don't know if you've worked with community colleges and know much about them, but they also take time off at Thanksgiving, and their staff takes time off at Thanksgiving. So not only was it announced and then it was due in a really short time, effectively you had to like get the team at the college to say yes within 2 days to be able to start like building. And then you needed all these letters, you need all these other support. They need people to effectively work over Thanksgiving because there's just no way you could finish everything after Thanksgiving before it was actually due. And then when they made the announcements within like 3 weeks or 4 weeks after that, and it seems very haphazard about how they reviewed those applications. So they had like this enormous volume of people applied over this short time frame because they haven't announced a ton of other funding available to community colleges. So they said, well, fine, we'll do it, but then on the back. So it's like the speed with which this stuff is happening is just you need to be able to do it faster. So to Fran's point, if you can do anything in any way, whether you're a government agency or even a nonprofit, like get yourself ready to apply, have projects in the can that you can like load up as soon as you find something that works for them. And practically speaking, that's what we're seeing. So,
and I would just also add partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
So my firm has done 2 large grants with governmental entities. The one that still stands is the CPRG grant, which is $129 million between Cuyahoga County, City of Cleveland, and the City of Painesville. And the more you can collaborate with others, and then also Cuyahoga County is very flexible, more flexible, I would say, as a governmental entity. It has been able to kind of maneuver the grant. They are the main grantee, and they have the sub grantees in the City of Cleveland and the City of Painesville. And so they've been able to kind of shape that. But again, these partnerships and then figuring out like who is the one who is the most flexible, who has the resources, right, to be able to maneuver this. But money's coming fast. They don't really care, but you really have to get your ducks in a row, which is really difficult to do when you don't know how to line them up because they don't give you that much time. But I would say, again, these partnerships, whether again it's between nonprofits and governmental entities, nonprofits together amongst themselves, really having that coalition of people, organizations, will just put you in a stronger position once funding comes through. So, okay, so then governance and internal controls and compliance, more fun stuff. But actually, this is the stuff where I geek out. I love this stuff. So you're talking to the right people here. I would say if you are a nonprofit and definitely as a governmental entity, you have a conflict of interest policy, right? This is essential for any grant, right? And you just have to make sure that your policy is in line with what the grant says, and if it's a federal grant with the 2 CFR 200, or the specific grant that you're getting, you need to look at that. You need to, as Pat mentioned, like sometimes you're going to have travel funds. And if you have travel funds, you're going to need to have a travel policy. Again, that relates to the funding. So this is where things get a little bit tricky because maybe your organization already has a travel policy. You're going to have to make sure that either they're the same or the difference. And the person who approves travel in your organization knows if they are different, This is just regular travel for X organization, but this is travel under the grant dollars. So you don't necessarily have to, you can adopt two policies. You can have two policies, one for the grant funding, one for your normal funding. But you're gonna also have to have that internal control as to, okay, this is travel policy A. I'm underneath this one. This is travel policy B. And that the person who knows that knows the difference between the two. So you're gonna want to have, again, same thing with procurement. And as Pat mentioned, depending on what type of entity you are, you're going to have multiple layers of procurement. Again, that what I talked about the city of Cleveland and grant funding with the city of Cleveland procurement policies, again, they're there for a reason. And I believe in those reasons, transparency, and so that you're not playing around with tax dollars. The problem is that when you layer, it becomes impossible to spend the money. And these dollars are, I wouldn't say they're free dollars, but they are used to supplement and to enhance your work. And when you can't use them, it's why get them, right? And so we're living in a time where these old structures were in place for a reason, and we have to come up with better ones with the technology that we have and the ability to show the transparency. We haven't figured out the new way. And so I think that's where I think especially governments, nonprofits, a little bit different because they're a little more nimble. But depending on the layers that you've got, makes it difficult to spend the dollars. So again, procurement, you might want to have two different policies. You might want to have, this is the federal policy, and this is what for these dollars, this is how we're going to spend it. And we have to document. And this is our internal general policy. You can have those two different policies. Ideally, you marry them and you have one. But if you're a nimble nonprofit, you might not want to have such draconian limited policies for everything, right? And if you're a government, you might have the federal ones might even be too liberal. So it's really, you need to look internally at your organization and what makes sense. And again, having two policies, I would never advocate for that, but sometimes that is easier. So you have to figure out what makes sense for your organization. That's the same thing with the finance policy. Any of these conflict of interest, again, make sure that you've got your own internal conflict of interest. Just make sure that they are in line with, and they really, for the most part, should. I think that's the easiest one where you can combine that, right? And so probably what you're already doing satisfies what the federal government's going to want you to do, or whoever the grantor is. But those are the different things you need to look through and look at your different policies.
I would add a good example of the travel policy one is that if you get a federal grant, you're required to, for example, if you purchase airfare, you're required to fly on an American carrier. So even if your policy says something like, we choose the lowest cost available flight for whatever reason, and it's Air France or Air Canada, you cannot reimburse that based on federal policies. You have to buy American. This is one of the examples that fits that. So just as an example, why you might choose to have two separate policies and why you might think through some of those pieces too. I also think it's worth mentioning, if there's a rule or a policy or something that we've said that sounds like, oh my God, that sounds so stupid, or it sounds like it's just going to take so much time, I would challenge you to think of how somebody broke that rule and why we now have to. So like, you're going to get to some of these things, and reporting's fine too. You'll get to some of these things, you'll think like, conflict of interest is a great one, because it makes perfect sense to have great conflict of interest. Like you can't possibly buy in greater Cleveland or in Northeast Ohio. I have a million choices for everything I want to buy just about. But when you get into like rural Ohio, then it just so happens that the only printer in town is my brother in town. And so then you're like, well, I should be able to use him because like he's the only printer in town and I know he's reliable or whatever. But then you start to look and say like, okay, well, at some point somebody said, yeah, my brother-in-law's the printer. He's getting $1 million of this contract. And you start to see like, okay. Anyway, that's a fun challenge. I very briefly want to cover reporting. People get very nervous about reporting. The way that it works is going to be dependent on the type of project that you have and the type of funding you have and where it ultimately stems from. Financial reporting for federal grants, for example, is actually fairly straightforward, but it's extremely confusing if you just look at the documents. And so when I'm doing a reimbursement right now, and I'm working with a client, and it's through the Department of Transportation. And so the Department of Transportation has created a spreadsheet that they want us to use to like guide this process, which in theory is extremely helpful, and in practice is extremely mixed on its helpfulness. And so when we fill that sheet out, great. Okay, that takes a lot of time to do. And then secondarily, you then have to get all the invoices. In this case, we have to also prove that we've paid someone before they'll reimburse it. So you need all that proof. You'll need something to say like that this is a valid expense, specifically like the contract. What did they do in order to get paid for it? Like in this time, so you have like a description of what they've done. Then you have to do a federal form to fill it out. But like once you've done it once, in our case, once you've done it twice or three times, like it's so easy to do. It just takes sitting down to do. And so that is my lesson with reporting. It ends up being fairly straightforward. It may be extremely confusing on the front end, and setting up the systems to gather the information is a separate problem, but the actual physical reporting of things, it can be straightforward. Again, it'll depend on what you're collecting information on. But it's also, again, I'll use that example of the conflict of interest, right? Like you want to think through why they want you to capture this data. So you happen to get community development block grant funds, and you need to go door to door in Old Brooklyn neighborhood to figure out how many people actually needed this service and got it. Like there's a real reason, right? Like they're spending the money on useful, valuable things. But it's annoying to think like, okay, how am I going to collect that data? How am I going to come back and aggregate that data and do those sorts of things? This is also where it relates to that reading the funding opportunity announcement at the beginning, understanding at least basically what kinds of things you're going to have to track, and then setting up systems. Spreadsheets are okay systems. Like Google Forms are okay systems to be able to start tracking it. And there are more sophisticated ones available. So it just depends on the level of what you want to do. Yeah, and then the final one, I think the final one of our slides here is about security and safety. This is mostly extremely annoying, can be helpful, and I would encourage you to get help from someone if this is not your area. So cyber requirements have increased, cybersecurity requirements have increased a ton in the last 3 years. I was working with a client on a grant, and they had to develop like a complete cyber policy in order to get the funding. This was after they'd been awarded the funding. They were in sort of that negotiation phase, right? Where like the agency came back and said, okay, we like you, we want you, but I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And one of those was to draft a cybersecurity policy that covered a ton of this stuff, for example. And it was like 50 pages, and literally no one's ever going to read it. I'm sure they put it through an AI generator to be like, does this meet our requirements for a cybersecurity policy? This sort of thing is happening more and more. It's the kind of stuff that it is very important, right? Like personally identifiable information, yeah, super important. Also, really obnoxious. So like once you've got the grant and you want to get to that point, like this is also going to relate to that reporting and the data requirements. It's going to relate to how you keep track of program files, right? So 10 years ago, we would just have a paper file in a locked file cabinet somewhere. And so when the feds wanted to check and see if you were doing what you said they were doing, they would show up at your door and say, we're here to monitor you, provide us with paper file number XYZ. You'd go unlock the cabinet, pull the file out, relock the cabinet all in front of them to like prove that you were secure. That's not the era that we live in, right? Like that's just not there. And so how you do all these things relates to how you can effectively prove them. I will encourage you to use AI if you're confused about some of these, like lean on that as a like guide, but also do your best. Like I'm not, it's not like my professional advice is do your best. And most agencies, most award grantors are people who really do understand what you will be going through most of the time. There are some that are, but as you get through it, you're going to say, okay, I have no idea what we're supposed to do for fraud prevention on this community development block grant. And they're going to say, here's our advice. Like you build that relationship with your contact, like Fran said earlier, they'll give you who your program officer, the agency that you're working with. And they've done this before. They may not be great. In many instances, they're great. Like there are some people who they get a bad rep, but they are really want to be helpful. So ask them. And if you don't know, ask us. Ask someone that might know this stuff, but we can figure out ways to help because it's confusing. And they are going to be adding, like they just add more of these things all the time, right? So cyber was added. I guarantee the next 5 years there will be AI stuff added to this. Like once the administration, if there's an administration change, if there is a change in the way that we view AI, we as a policy entity, not we, sure. But as you reach that point, they're going to say, you can't put certain things into an AI, right? Like they're going to start to make you have policies for that. I fully expect that. Those sorts of things.
The only thing I would say is I think depending on your type of organization, you're already going to be thinking about access controls. The smaller you are, you probably aren't thinking of it. You know, it's like it's that gradient of like where you are in terms of your size of organization. So I think that like there is that weird time where you're small, you're nimble, everyone has access. This is the type of thing, depending on where you are, like this is the type of thing where you want to just make sure. And so I would just say from my professional opinion, just making sure access and who has it. And again, there's so many other laws that govern this. So it's not something that I think is coming out of nowhere. But I would just say, depending on the type of organization that you're in, you don't think about it till you have to think about it. And this would be a place where I would say, okay, start thinking about it.
Yeah, I think I would only I would sort of close with this, right? That I think when you get a grant award, there is a moment of pure celebration, right? Like we did win this award. Then there's the immediate moment of, oh my God, what are we going to do? Because like I remember that presentation and I fell asleep and then I woke up and halfway through there was like talking all the stuff. And so what I think you got to think about is how are you as an organization going to like take that moment and just keep like good vibes going, right? Like keep the stuff going in the right direction. You're going to the at least federal government, federal program officers largely want you to do what you say you will do. That's their underlying assumption on all of this. They're going to say you've got to make it past the post. You got to get rules, controls, everything's got to be in place at bare minimum so that like again, this is like the idea. You're using taxpayer funds appropriately, right? So like, great, like you've made it past that first barrier. You've gone through the first gate. After that, all the rest of these controls, all these policies that are in place, they're going to say you have to have a policy. They're not going to write the policy for you. So you write the policy. Then they're going to want to make sure that you're doing what you told them you said you would do, right? So you said we had a conflict of interest policy. Show me when you did that printing contract with your brother-in-law, like I need proof that this didn't violate the conflict of interest policy, right? And that's where it starts to feel like when you're in the day-to-day doing the work, you're like, oh my God, do I have to follow every single one? Like really, like I just know New Growth so good, they're going to do a great job with technical assistance piece. Why do I have to get two other folks? But at the end, it's because you said you would do that in your procurement policy. So they want to track that. And that's the whole game is like, once you do the bare minimum, then it's what you said you would do, did you do it? And then at the end, they're going to say, great, congrats, check the box, move on, nothing. Or they're going to say, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. Let's have like another conversation about what that means, right? And so if you got a federal grant and you did nothing and spent half the money, but didn't really deliver the outcomes you said you would, the big negative of that in the future is that when you go to apply for addition, it's not the only, but the big negative on that is like, you're going to go to apply for funding in the future. One of the main questions is always, what's your experience with federal grants or other grants? And you're going to say, well, we had this one and there were reasons, but we didn't do what we said we would do. And so that's like, you will lose points in the future potentially on those kinds of things. Not always, and sometimes I'm saying circumstances, but that's the closing thought I would have.
There's plenty we could say, but I want to take questions from you, and happy to stay after too if people have further questions.
Mark Miller, NPLRC's intake coordinator, I know has been monitoring the chat, and I think I've seen some questions pop up there. We'd also like to take questions from those of you in the room. Mark, is there an immediate?
It's about sharing information.
No.
About sharing information after it's over and stuff like that, but I don't see any substantive questions.
Probably because you covered very much in our little time together. I sense that there will be questions after, and among my responsibilities today, I am charged with asking when we're through that folks join us in the hallway because this room is being used for an additional program later. But I believe that our panelists can remain, and I can also make their contact information available. If anyone leaves without it today, they can certainly get to Pat and Fran through me. Thank you both for serving as panelists today. Thank you to all of you who have joined us here and online. Thank you to our teammates here at CMBA who supported this event, and to the Greater Cleveland Funders Collaborative and NPLRC's funders. We have a QR code which goes to our intake form. If you are a nonprofit that has a legal inquiry, that is the best way to get in touch with us and communicate your need so that we can help you completely and expeditiously. Also, NPLRC enjoys a number of strong institutional partnerships, and among them, we have a relationship with Big Change Consulting, which offers free financial management support for nonprofits. That comes in the form of training and one-to-one consulting. So I would encourage you to scan the QR code to learn more. Our friends at Advocacy and Communication Solutions provide free communication training and have a training session planned for early May. They also have 2 surveys, one for your present communications practices, and then needs that they can tailor their training around your questions. And on the topic of May, the NPLRC will host another panel presentation. Next up is Mechanics of Mediation, which will take place on Tuesday, May 19th at 9 a.m. So again, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our panelists, and I hope that you will join me in the hallway for questions and networking. Appreciate it.